Blog Talk Radio.
This is the News in 10 on the 17th day of September 2013, coming from the place that spanned the Occupy movement, which is now worldwide. We'll get to that in a minute. This is the second anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, which spanned Occupy Zapatero and various other Occupy movements over the world. And it brought the awareness of the nation and the world, specifically here in the U.S., to the 1%. Even President Obama has to concede that the 1% owns at least 40% of the wealth, and they say working on the count up every day. The 99% is relegated to the rest of what is left over. And now that is subdivided to those that make above $100,000 a year. And then we have the people that work for $7.25 or less at the McDonald's of the world, the Burger Kings of the world, these so-called fast food operations, and an army of other so-called small businesses, sectors, small enterprises in the U.S. It is known that these type of operations, especially the smaller ones, did not provide any type of health coverage. The Walmarts and some of the others provided some health coverage, but it was very, very expensive, almost $200 a month for minimal coverage. And not only that, as far as health coverage, students, we were praised of a Aetna policy. That's another insurer in the U.S., a very large one. They had a policy at Rutgers, of all places, that covered very little, mostly co-pays and upfront costs for various types of procedures. Didn't cover dental, didn't cover eye care, etc. So in that backdrop, the Occupy movement continues on. There's an interesting study out here, and this is a new book, takes a look, three new books actually, at Occupy Wall Street as a movement, as the sociologists would say. The occupation of Liberty Square. This is the second anniversary there. And in cities from Boston to Oakland to Fairbanks to Miami in Florida, Duluth to Shreveport in Louisiana. So various cities there, on Twitter and various other sites out there. We are the 99% on Tumblr and others here. The Occupy Wall Street, the Brooklyn-based magazine N+1 produced a newspaper called Occupy Gazette, and scenes from the Occupy America as Vasco there. So the newest crops of books about Occupy are out there. From the beginning, people frequenting the plaza, and that was in downtown Manhattan, Liberty Square. One was Nathan Schindler began his book, Thank You. Notes from the Occupy Apocalypse. And how the Occupy movement was transformed until it was brutally put down by Homeland Security and the Mayor Bloomberg, who himself is leaving. Schindler's education, much of his writings are concerned with religion. He relies heavily upon Christian vocabulary, all we need, I suppose. The rapture of the ordinary that characterizes these days, he writes, everything felt in some sense of religious change, with a secret extremity and transcendency. The Occupy was an ebb of grace and fall. Oh well, so much for that. The biblical concept of apocalypse revelations that he invokes, well, a little too much of that in the American society. This bubbling sense of potential in the park was maintained in large part by the problematic demands in favor of an almost monolithical focus on process, a constant concern for horizon, principles of inclusion and autonomy. Schindler writes, this was the kind of politics most had never quite experimented with, a kind of apparently necessary even if its consequences seemed externally obscure. Top-level discussions were made through the General Assembly, an all-inclusive body that decided issues through achieving consensus rather than a bare majority, using a deliberative process that encouraged every word to be heard. This process produced exacerbatingly long meetings, but also a powerful sense of ownership and investment among the participants. It was a system that left much space on govern and Occupy empowered to start their own projects, newspapers, etc. Well, that was a good thing about it in that sense, but in the sense of a movement, it was not as good. But they've since modified their principles. The principles behind the movement were handily new. They had deep roots in the anarchist condition. That's according to Mark by a former member of Occupy Wall Street's press team. He also has a new book, translating Anarchy, the Anarchists of the Wall Street Occupation, from Zero Books, how Occupy managed to reframe and popularize their principles for a public for whom the word anarchy remains dark, terrifying, and misunderstood. Well, we have a little disagreement with him as to the anarchist part of it there, and that would be debatable because in America, historically, the term anarchy or anarchist has an individualist type connotation, whereas these people were really trying to be collective as much as they could in the backdrop. Even so, it's parts of this privilege of process over demand that baffled many critics there. Mr. Thomas Frank reviews the first crop of Occupied-related books. The battle last year, Don't Fall in Love with Yourself, and I won't even attempt to pronounce this fellow's name. Zizek. Anyway, not everyone has been so certain that the Occupy euphoric celebration of process was such a waste of time. Responding to Frank in Joblin magazine last winter, Peter Frazier counted the collective essence of Occupy's carnival is something that needs to be part of the left, even if it can't be the whole of it. From David Gerben, an anarchic scholar and author of Democracy Project, A History, a Crisis, a Movement, Occupy's post-eviction strategy could be blamed primarily on evidential official of mainstream liberals like Move On and various Democratic politicians, radicals in the park. He offers an excellent explanation of values of carnival in the park. For many, a visit to Liberty Square exposed their sense of boundaries of what was politically possible. The experience of those who lived through through such events to find out horizon throwed open. He writes to find themselves wondering what else we assume cannot really happen actually can, but during and after the eviction, Gerben, the liberal establishment, moved generally and made a strategic decision to look the other way. Well, the liberal establishment, and this is something to remember, is a social democratic establishment patterned after, in the European sense. Here in the U.S., it's right of center. The Lib Dems in the U.K. would be an example, a little different. They're a little bit more to left of center than the Social Democrats or Democrats in the U.S. But that is a strategical situation as to where the U.S. politics is a right of center. But the great influence there has nothing really to do with the occupiers, the liberal establishment, one has to understand, and that is what part of it you are actually talking about. If you're talking about the third way operators like Bill Clinton and his presidency were, and to a certain extent many of the people that surround President Obama. Larry Summers would be a good example. He sort of bit the dust, was rejected as not being acceptable, and you can point to the occupiers. Without the occupiers, we would not have the term 99%. In our opinion, that was their greatest contribution to the movement, and that is a very powerful movement. Many people would focus on what happened at Liberty Square in their open debate, but open debate in this country is not something. SDS had that, and of course SDS, one has to understand, and the same thing with the occupiers, was infiltrated immediately by the intelligence services. Not only were they brutally attacked and brutalized, but the New York police departments and their red squads sent in people on the street, sort of like this guy Alex, that was at the shipyard, that mentally not balanced. People that were on wine and narcotics, and they were given narcotics, and to go into the group and to basically raise hell within the group there, assault people, and those kinds of antisocial behavior. See, it's very easy to get antisocial personalities, and the U.S. has its share, no doubt. And these personalities themselves can be modified. You'll hear this in the naval yard situation. We have an individual that was under treatment, quote unquote, for hearing of voices and various other things, sleep disorders, and he's in a supposed meditation group. And he has another personality there as a very peaceful person, but at the same time he has this record, supposedly, records can be made by the minute, of from Seattle to Texas, of causing disturbances, of antisocial behavior, etc. So when you put those people into the mix, you'll have that. Within 2 months, police had violently expelled the people. This is from Al Jazeera article here, which is very timely. Both Gerben and Schindler echo some of the often repeated answers to questions, whatever happened to the Occupy, that have been asked over the past year and a half in the diaspora from its home park. Offshoot groups strike debt, and not that these are offshoot groups. These groups are actually groups that are in the same theme, or under the same theme. And this is one of the problems that, from the American standpoint, that Americans really don't see integration in the bigger picture. They see something in a very small time shot, and not in a shot of years, months, days, and of years. And the impact of, we'll go to the advertisers, what's called a brand. Well, their brand is the 99%. And that is popularized literally from the White House to Rome to Argentina, and you name it, points in between. So that in itself, and not only that, the entire campaign, the campaign of the reformists, mayor candidate there in New York, Bill de Blasio, he has taken the same theme and turned it into the tale of two cities, and popularized that to a city of 10 million people. Now, nothing is new about that. They had Figaro LaGuardia. He was a famous reform mayor. Now, this man is not LaGuardia. We don't want to put him in that realm. But at the same time, in terms of the 2013 type of situation, nonetheless, car bomb in the Syria-Turkey border. The General Assembly, incidentally, began today on U.S.-Iran meeting there, and U.S. probe exposes shocking, UN probe, I'm sorry, how I said U.S., misspoke there, in the Korean Democratic Republic. Well, the whole problem with so-called rights abuse, the U.S. has the biggest prison population of those incarcerated in the world. And in fact, a prison strike across California, coming from a maximum security place called Pelican Institution in Northern California, ended a week or two ago. There were hundreds of prisoners involved in that strike. They were force-fed, but we don't hear this highlighted as the topics here. You look at even Al Jazeera, you'll see human rights. Well, human rights extend to the vast prison complex within the U.S., and it's not only a state prison complex, as they'll have you believe, in the Democratic Republic of Korea, but there are private prisons and semi-private prisons. California is subcontracting with private prisons, with county-type installations, cities, etc., to lessen their prison population. Now, those are violations of human rights, but they're not framed properly within North America so that people start to understand it, and also monopoly news media. There's very little information on this that comes out to the people, and that is very, very unfortunate. And when we're gathering reports here, we have to move around to find some sources and some secondary sources for our reporting. And this is the 68th session of the General Assembly. It's also in New York, where the Occupy movement is celebrating their movement, and leaders of the world will be there and address the UN. So we'll see many of those world leaders, including Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran, will be there, amongst others. Oh, wait a minute, I might have misspoke on that. The only Iranian official there is Zarif Zarat. Well, he'll be meeting with Haig, so we'll see there. But even the president there, Rouhani, he tweeted that. So everyone is on Twitter. President Rouhani will be actually there in New York. So the other world leaders, we'll cover that, incidentally, that event in New York as it comes forward. We'll also be a little late in our broadcast, but that will be good. The president of Brazil has called off the trip here. Dilma Rousseff has called off a state visit to Washington next month over the espionage operation. This was a part of the release of Jean Greenwald, a reporter for The Guardian that's, of course, based in Rio de Janeiro. That would have been, would have been the first state visit here since in the U.S. since 1995. It was in late October on the 23rd. The Brazilian government statement, given the proximity of the scheduled state visit to Washington and the absence of a timely investigation of the incident, with corresponding explanation and commitment to cease the intercept activity, it could not go ahead as planned. The statement said Brazil hoped the visit would take place as soon as possible once the issue had been resolved properly. The White House mouthpiece only could say, the spokesman for the White House, it should not overshadow any bilateral issues. Well, it is all about this, and what is happening here is, and we've seen this happen, this is the shadow of the Occupy movement. Because without the Occupy movement and the awareness of the 99% struggle against the 1%, we would have not had an Edward Snowden, more than likely. And without Edward Snowden, we would not have had the backlash against the NSA, the CIA, and we would have been, I use we in a generic term, the U.S. would have been bombarding Damascus, Syria. That did not happen because the atmosphere has changed. The Wilsonian foreign policy, which the U.S. has been following, named after the racist segregationist Woodrow Wilson, the man that segregated the federal workforce. So that has changed, and now we have this trip canceled. And so the Occupy movement, the books we talked about that were there, really are not the actual story of the influence of the Occupy Wall Street, Liberty Plaza. The word liberty has a ring like a bell in the U.S., and that is a leftover relic from the French idea, the French liberals. They were sort of displaced by other commentators on the world scene, the Marxist socialist movements replaced the bourgeois liberals. But nonetheless, the bourgeois liberals are now out there, and let me continue with that presidential statement. The president has said that he understands and regrets the concerns that disclosures of alleged U.S., it's not alleged, it's an actual fact, have generated in Brazil, and made clear that he's committed to working together with President Roosevelt and her government in the diplomatic channels. Well, they're not going to work in diplomatic channels because the diplomatic channels themselves are compromised. That's the whole issue. You can't work on a compromised situation. And this is what it's all about. So there is a new, literally a new era in American foreign policy, bilateral relationships. And with this, the U.S., it's sort of like big data. And the Ed Snowden affair is no doubt big data. And the NSA is part of the CIA in the UK and in France and what have you. The latest rendition of that was in the Syrian crisis, German ships sitting offshore intercepting phones. Now, supposedly. And this whole idea of credibility comes up. If you believe the person, there's not a problem. If you disbelieve the person, there is a problem. So in the Syrian conflict, the numbers of people and the circumstances of the chemical gassing were relayed to the U.S., and the Secretary of Minister of State Kerry reported it, but it came from the Mossad. If you trust the Mossad, you trust the information. It came from the British, the French, and the Germans. But they have a dark history in more than one way. So within the wider world, the emerging world where the majority of people live, their word is not trusted, as we'd say in the U.S. So without any type of trust in what they have to say, that is the end of the conversation. Thus enters the Russian Republic and V.I. Putin. And V.I. Putin, incidentally, the Russian Republic, are allied with Brazil, and several other countries, India, etc., in their own economic pacts. Those would not be here without the Occupy movement in New York, in Liberty Park. So there are many positive things that are here that are bigger than these books that you see. The books are parochial. They turn one from a religious standpoint that I see has nothing to do with that. That has as much to do with meditation as the alleged gunman at the shipyard. But it all swirls around in the limitations of how analysis is done within the U.S. It's not, as we started this out, it's not done in an integrated manner, and it's done with a very narrow digital snapshot by the hour and by the day and by the week at most. And of the Occupy movement, we have a 2-year snapshot, but the books basically before the Occupy movement was crushed in Liberty Park, but not only there, but in California, they had a cop there spraying mace into the eyes of people. A woman had a miscarriage. Brutal police suppression of this movement. That is why it died. It was not about the methods, the so-called anarchistic methods that they used, rattling the anarchists back to Emma Goldman and whomever else you want to go to. I guess you could go to Bakunin. But what has happened here is a totally different situation. Movements continue on, and movements take a form of their own. So the Occupy movement that was in the U.S. empowered individuals like Ed Snowden to come forward, which this movement is moving on, a greater movement that is timely on the 17th of September 2013, as it was on the 17th of September 2011 just in New York. And this is the way you have to look at this particular movement and the people that it inspired and the world events that it has inspired. So in other words, it went from just a local New York situation on to California, the places like Shreveport, Louisiana, etc. The movement against foreclosures, the movement against Larry Summers, the whole movement to expose these third world, third way types, and people will now scrutinize, and it will go not only now but into 2014 September 11th, 2016 September 19th, 17th. So we have these things moving on. They are not stopping. So the presidential candidates here in the U.S. and many other places will be scrutinized differently. Already, the leading candidate in 2016, they say, Hillary the Monster Clinton, is already on the scrutiny because of the Libyan conflict. And one has to see where those cards will fall when that comes up there. But we also see these emerging politicians like the Twitter king, one Cory Booker from the urban ghetto of Newark, New Jersey. He will be seen more and more as the Larry Summers of Newark. He's bought and paid for by Wall Street. And there are many more than we see there. These so-called middle-of-the-road, moderate-type candidates that drake themselves in a little bit of a quote-unquote what is the progressive cause of the day. And the people, with the help of the monopoly media, now the monopoly media were forced to take up the word Occupy, Wall Street. Well, they popularized it. But at the same time, the NSA, in particular Homeland Security, were running around the nation from Shreveport, Louisiana, Jacksonville, Florida, to various other sundry small cities, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and very little towns, training police forces in mass via their web type forecasts, broadcasts I should say, and regional seminars on how to deal with the Occupy movement. arming them with different types of lethal gas. Now, talking about lethal gas, that is what they were using. Same thing, violation of human rights. But yet it was never projected in the monopoly media in the U.S. It had to be taken up somewhat, but in a very tacit way, by media in the U.S. By media in the international sphere. So we had Al Jazeera, now we have the networks out of the former Soviet Union, Iran, and various other places that are on satellite, on the internet, that are broadcasting. But you have to look at it in terms of numbers. Some of the networks here in the U.S. have millions and millions of people in the U.S. that listen to them, that, as the right-wing broadcaster Rush Limbaugh would say, the low-value voters. They're not all at Yahoo News. They're at his broadcast. They're at Fox. They're at MSNBC and various other places, because much of this type of analysis is very quick analysis, done within 10 minutes at most, of crucial situations. Very, very seldom do you get a 20-minute discussion of any issue on that type of media. Even Al Jazeera now has fewer and fewer one-hour programs because they now have an American version. So they will have to, as they say, go with the rest of the club. This is Bostonred on the 17th of September 2013. Basically, we'll call this Remembering Occupy Wall Street. Good day.